Have you ever imagined having the power to turn everything you touch into gold? For King Midas, this seemed like the dream of a lifetime. But what if I told you that this seemingly perfect wish ended up becoming his greatest curse? Today, we're going to dive into the story of the kingdom of Midas and discover how a king's greed led him to lose everything that truly mattered. And more. You'll understand that sometimes what seems to be the greatest blessing can actually be the biggest prison. Stay with me until the end, because the lesson Midas learned could change the way you see what truly matters in life. The warm afternoon breeze glided through the marble halls of the palace, carrying with it the distant murmur of servants and the metallic sound of coins being counted. King Midas sat on his great throne, made of solid gold, observing his riches, with watchful but empty eyes. He had everything a man could desire, overflowing vaults, rare jewels, and a prosperous city under his command. Yet, something bothered him, an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't name. Not far from there, in the palace, Gardens, an old storyteller surrounded by young apprentices, was telling an ancient lesson. He held a small silver pouch and let a coin fall into his palm as he spoke. Words are worth silver. Then he paused for a long moment before continuing, but silence is worth gold. The apprentices glanced at each other, confused, but the storyteller just smiled, waiting for them to understand. Midas, who was passing by, overheard the phrase but only rolled his eyes. What nonsense! Gold was what truly mattered. Words were just words. He never stopped to think about the meaning of that lesson, never reflected on the power of poorly chosen words. Had he done so, perhaps he could have avoided the mistake he was about to make. But fate, relentless as always, had already set the pieces of the game in motion. And it would all begin with a drunk old man lost in the forests of his kingdom. As Midas made his way back inside the palace, the apprentices, still gathered around the old storyteller, asked for one more lesson. The elder adjusted his worn tunic, looked up at the sky where the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, and decided to tell them a story about a god who knew both joy and pain. Before we talk about the fate of Midas, he began in a mysterious tone. We need to talk about Dionysus, the god who granted him the gift that nearly destroyed him. The young ones settled in to listen more closely. Everyone knew Dionysus as the god of wine, parties, and ecstasy, but few knew the pain that accompanied his birth. He should never have been born, the storyteller said, lowering his voice as if revealing a forbidden secret. His mother, Semele, was only a mortal, but she won the love of Zeus, the king of the gods. And Hera, Zeus' wife, couldn't stand to see her husband fall in love with another woman. The apprentices held their breath. It was common for Zeus to have mortal lovers, and it was also common for Hera to take revenge on them. But what followed was one of the greatest cruelties of the jealous goddess. Disguised as a kind old woman, the storyteller continued, Hera approached Semele and whispered doubts into her mind. If Zeus really loves you, she said, why doesn't he show you his true divine form? The apprentices exchanged glances. They knew mortals couldn't look at a god in his full form without being destroyed. Semele, poisoned by doubt, asked Zeus to swear an oath. He, in love, promised to grant her any wish she desired. And then the old man paused dramatically. She asked to see him as he truly was. The young ones gasped. Zeus tried to convince her to change her mind, but a divine oath cannot be broken. He revealed himself in all his splendor, and Semele was consumed by the flames. The group fell silent. Even Midas, pretending not to listen, was intrigued by the story. But the baby she carried in her womb could still be saved. Before it was too late, Zeus pulled him from the ashes and, to protect him, sewed him into his own thigh until he was ready to be born. And thus, Dionysus came into the world, the only demigod to achieve true immortality. The storyteller smiled as he saw the wide eyes of the apprentices. Dionysus grew up among gods and mortals, learning both about pain and pleasure, and became the god of celebration, wine, and madness. But he was also generous, and it was this generosity that would one day bring Midas to face his greatest mistake. The sun was nearly set, and the apprentices were eager for more. But the old storyteller simply raised his hand as if to say, "Patience. Tomorrow I will tell you what happened when Dionysus met a certain king obsessed with gold." On the other side of the garden, Midas clenched his fists. He hated stories about gods playing with the fate of men. If only the gods would grant riches without tricks, without lessons in disguise. But he didn't know that soon he would be the protagonist of the next story told around that fire. The following night, the apprentices returned to the palace garden, eager to hear more of the tale. The old storyteller waited until everyone was settled and with a keen look resumed the narrative. "Now that you know the origin of Dionysus," he said, playing with a vine branch between his fingers, "it's time to talk about the most peculiar companion of this god, Silenus." Some of the young ones laughed upon hearing the name. Silenus was known to be a hardened drunkard, an old man with a stumbling walk, always carrying a wineskin. But the storyteller simply smiled and shook his head. "Ah, my young ones, don't be fooled by appearances. Silenus might stumble like a fool, but his mind was sharp as a warrior's blade. He wasn't just a drunkard, he was a wise man, a master of ancient stories and the world's secrets." The apprentices adjusted themselves, intrigued. Midas, listening from afar, furrowed his brow. How could someone who spent his days drunk be wise? "Silenus was a satyr," the old man continued, "a creature half man, half goat, who followed Dionysus everywhere. They say he taught the god of wine when he was still young, and in return for his loyalty, Dionysus kept him by his side. And for all eternity, the young ones exchanged glances. But if he was so wise, why was he always drunk?" Into one of them asked. The storyteller smiled and looked up at the starry sky. "Perhaps because he saw the world as it truly is," he replied enigmatically. "There are truths too heavy to carry sober." The group fell silent. Midas, listening intently without admitting it, felt a chill. For years, Dionysus and Silenus traveled together, spreading wine and liberation. Wherever they went, mortals gave in to pleasure and forgot their pains. But Silenus, despite his almost constant drunkenness, observed everything and knew that excess always came at a cost. The storyteller leaned forward as if about to reveal a great secret. And that's how, during one of their long travels, Silenus got lost. And his path led him straight to the kingdom of a certain king, obsessed with gold. The young ones held their breath. But that, my friends, is for tomorrow. The complaints came immediately, but the old storyteller just laughed, slowly standing up. "Patience, patience. Wine needs time to mature, and so does a good story." On the other side of the garden, Midas remained silent. He didn't know, but fate had already set the gears in motion, and very soon he would meet Silenus in person. The night was calm in the Phrygian palace, but inside the golden walls, King Midas couldn't find rest. He paced back and forth in his chamber filled with riches, his hands gliding over chests overflowing, with coins, jewels, and precious objects. To anyone who looked, it was the kingdom of abundance, but for Midas, it was never enough. Outside, the peasants gathered in small clay houses, sharing bread and wine under the moonlight. Inside the palace, the king dined alone at a table too large, surrounded by servants who never dared speak to him. His greatest fear was losing what he had, and so he hoarded everything he could, counting his coins every night before bed, as if gold were armor against poverty and time. The stories about his greed spread throughout Phrygia. It was said that once a starving man asked him for a piece of bread, and Midas, instead of helping, ordered that he be expelled from the kingdom. It was also said that he hid his greatest riches, even from his own servants, afraid of being robbed. But what no one knew, and what Midas would never admit, was the emptiness that grew inside him. As a child, he had been a joyful boy, running through the fields, not worrying about wealth. But as he grew older, he saw that gold brought power. The more he possessed, the more he was respected, and at some point, without realizing it, he began to believe that only wealth could protect him from pain, loss, and insignificance. His daughter, the young Zoe, was the only one who tried to break through that wall of greed. She didn't care for jewels or thrones. She preferred to play in the gardens, sing and dance with the palace servants. "Father, come see the sunset," she called, tugging at his hand. But Midas, always busy counting his riches, replied without looking at her, "The sun sets every day, daughter. Gold, once lost, doesn't return." She sighed and returned to the garden, feeling that her father's true gold was locked away in safes and not in his heart. But fate had plans for Midas. For far from there, Silenus had gotten lost, and his path was about to cross with the king of Phrygia. That morning, the sun lazily rose over Phrygia, painting the fields golden. But inside the palace walls, an unusual commotion disturbed the routine. The guards had found an old man fallen among the vines of the royal garden. "Who dares to invade the domain of King Midas?" shouted one of the soldiers, approaching the body. He was a man of curious appearance, with a round belly, a messy beard, and skin marked by the sun. His clothes were stained with wine, and a strong smell of drunkenness filled the air. Even asleep, he seemed to be smiling as if dreaming of some mischief. The guards looked at each other. Surely this man wasn't a thief, for he carried nothing of value. And, by the state he was in, he didn't seem like a dangerous man either. "What should we do with him?" asked one of the soldiers. "Take him to the king," ordered the captain. "Midas will decide his fate." In the grand hall of the palace, Midas watched the stranger with suspicion. That dirty, scruffy old man didn't seem worthy of being in front of a king. "Who is this beggar?" he asked, frowning. Before the guards could respond, the old man woke up with a snore and stretched as if he were in his own house. "Oh, what fine hospitality," he said, yawning. "Vines so soft I slept like a baby." The soldiers were outraged by such disrespect, but Midas said nothing. He had heard that irreverent manner before. "Wait, I know this man," said the king, narrowing his eyes. "You're Silenus, Dionysus' companion, aren't you?" Silenus smiled and grabbed a wineskin that was inexplicably still full. "Ah, so you've heard of me," he replied, taking a generous gulp. "That makes things easier. Perhaps we'll celebrate this meeting with another barrel." The guards were horrified by such boldness, but to everyone's surprise, Midas burst out laughing. After all, having a friend of Dionysus in his palace wasn't an opportunity that came every day. "Prepare a feast," ordered the king. "My guest deserves a reception worthy of a god." And so, unknowingly, Midas had taken the first step to change his fate forever. The grand hall of King Midas's palace was transformed into a true paradise for lovers of wine and fine food. Long tables were covered with platters full of fresh fruits, juicy meats, and freshly baked bread. Servants ran back and forth, filling guests' cups, while musicians strummed harps and flutes to liven up the night. In the center of it all, Silenus laughed loudly, drinking as if his body were made only to process wine. His eyes shone with joy, and his round belly shook with every laugh. "Majesty, I must say," he spoke, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, "that this is the best reception I've ever had." Midas, sitting beside him, smiled with satisfaction. He wasn't. usually a generous host, but he knew that pleasing Silenus could bring great benefits. After all, if Dionysus was a god capable of granting favors, the king wanted to make sure he was on the right side when the opportunity came. A king should always treat his guests well, Midas replied, hiding his true intentions. Silenus raised his cup in a clumsy toast and then staggered back, almost falling off his chair. Everyone laughed, and the wine continued to flow into the night. In the following days, Silenus remained at the palace, enjoying all the comforts that Midas could offer. The king, in turn, pretended to be the perfect host, always with a smile on his face and a cordial tone in his voice. But deep down, his mind was occupied with one thought. How could he turn this hospitality into something even more valuable? He knew that sooner or later, Dionysus would come to reclaim his old companion. And when that moment came, Midas planned to be ready to receive his reward. What he didn't know was that his wish was about to become his greatest curse. News of Midas's hospitality quickly reached the ears of Dionysus. The god of wine, always generous with those who showed kindness to his followers, decided to reward the king personally. On the morning of the 10th day, when the sun was still rising over the Phrygian hills, a divine procession approached the palace. The air was filled with the sweet aroma of ripe grapes and wildflowers. The breeze carried a soft melody, as if nature itself were celebrating the arrival of the god. Midas, who had been eagerly awaiting this moment, hurried out to greet his illustrious visitor. As soon as Dionysus appeared, dressed in a purple tunic with a crown of ivy in his hair, the king bowed respectfully. "My dear Midas," said Dionysus with a relaxed smile, "I've heard that you treated my old friend Silenus with great generosity. A rare gesture of hospitality deserves to be rewarded." Midas beamed with a wide smile. Finally, the moment he had been waiting for had arrived. "You are very kind, great Dionysus. I've only done what a good host should do." Dionysus chuckled softly, as if he knew the king's true thoughts. But he was a god who didn't deny favors, even to those whose intentions were not so noble. "As thanks for your hospitality," Dionysus continued, "I will grant you a wish. Ask for whatever you want, and it will be yours." Midas's eyes sparkled. His heart raced. He knew exactly what he wanted. Without hesitation, he replied, "I want everything I touch to turn into gold." For a brief moment, Dionysus's smile disappeared. The god narrowed his eyes, studying the king's face. "Are you sure?" he asked in a more serious tone. "Absolutely," Midas declared, almost unable to contain his excitement. "With this power, I'll never have concerns again." Dionysus sighed. He had seen this type of ambition before and knew it wouldn't end well. But, as the gods always granted exactly what was asked, he simply extended his hand and declared, "So it shall be." A strange warmth coursed through Midas's body, as if an invisible electric current had passed through his veins. He felt a tingling in his fingertips and knew at that moment that his wish had been granted. His heart raced with excitement. Without wasting time, he rushed back to the palace to test his new gift, certain that from that day on, his life would be surrounded by endless wealth. Midas hurried into the palace garden, still feeling the strange heat running through his body. His heart pounded. He was a new man, a king with the supreme gift. He looked around, searching for something to test his power. His eyes landed on a dry branch lying on the ground. With a confident smile, he bent down and touched the worn wood. The moment he did, a golden glow spread across the branch, as if it were covered by a liquid light. Within seconds, the piece of wood was no longer just a simple stick, but a gleaming bar of solid gold. Midas' eyes widened in awe. "It works," he whispered to himself, feeling a growing euphoria. Without containing his excitement, he raised the golden branch towards the sky, letting the sun reflect off its shiny surface. His laughter echoed through the garden. This was the greatest blessing any man could receive. He quickly turned and ran into the palace. In the main hall, his first victim was a simple ceramic vase. As he touched it, the rough clay became a luxurious object of pure gold. He laughed and touched a chair, which immediately gleamed as if it were a throne worthy of the gods themselves. A wine glass? Gold. A curtain? Gold. The hall's columns? Gold. The servants watched in astonishment and fear. Some murmured that this power could only be a gift from the gods, or a terrible curse. But Midas saw nothing but glory. He walked through the palace like a conqueror before his new golden empire. "Bring a feast," he commanded. "Today is a day of celebration." The servants, hesitant, obeyed. They dared not question the king in his excitement. Midas settled into his newly transformed golden chair and eagerly waited. When the food arrived, he rubbed his hands, feeling his stomach growl. But as soon as he picked up a piece of bread, it hardened and turned into a gleaming bar of gold. He furrowed his brow, surprised. He tried to grab a bunch of grapes, but they solidified the moment his fingers touched them. The delicious aroma of wine filled his nostrils, but when he brought the cup to his lips, the liquid turned into pure metal, heavy and useless. Midas felt a chill down his spine. He tried again, grabbing a piece of meat, a slice of cheese, even a simple fig. But everything he touched instantly turned into gold, shining, magnificent, and completely inedible. The victorious smile faded from his face. "What is this?" he murmured, a hint of desperation creeping in. His servants exchanged glances, some already suspecting what was happening. Hunger began to set in, but Midas couldn't eat anything. Everything he touched turned to gold. What had once seemed like a gift was now turning into a nightmare. And this nightmare was just beginning. Midas stood up from the table, his heart racing. He looked at the feast now before him, but all he could see were piles of impassable gold, covered in a brilliant shine. He no longer knew what to do. His stomach growled with hunger, but he was trapped in his own creation. The gold he had desired so much was now his prison. Still, he refused to accept the reality. The king took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on his hand, and extended his arm, touching a piece of fruit, convinced that with one simple move, everything would be resolved. But again the fruit turned to gold, cold and useless. Desperate, Midas ran through the palace halls, touching everything in sight. The tapestries, the tables, the statues, everything turned to gold. The gleam of his own greed blinded him. He laughed to himself, but the laughter quickly turned into muffled terror. His eyes turned toward the garden, where the warmth of the sun bathed the flowers he loved so much. He ran there, thinking that maybe, by touching something simpler, the spell of gold would be broken. But the touch of his hands on a branch of flowers did nothing but turn them golden and lifeless. The fragrance that once enchanted him was now gone, and the garden, which had once been an explosion of colors and scents, now looked like a cemetery of metal. Midas stopped in the middle of the garden, gasping, his hands sweaty. He realized that his curse was not only in his inability to eat, but also in his disconnection from everything around him. Even nature, which had once been his friend, now seemed dead in his eyes. The golden glow surrounding him, instead of bringing joy, only amplified his sense of loneliness. He had lost the touch of life, the touch that made things truly valuable. It was then that he remembered something he had forgotten until that moment: his daughter. His daughter, who always played in the garden, picking flowers and making crowns of ivy. She loved the vibrant colors and the aromas that filled the palace. But now, with the curse he had brought upon himself, nothing was beautiful or vibrant anymore. Everything had turned to gold. A pang of longing gripped his chest. and a searing pain spread through his body. Midas looked at the palace, hoping to see the small figure of his daughter playing, but there was no one. "Child," he murmured, his voice filled with sorrow. He then ran to the hall where they used to spend their days together. But as he entered, what he saw made him stop immediately. His daughter, whom he had loved so much, was standing in the middle of the room. But she wasn't playing, she wasn't smiling. She was rigid, motionless, with a golden glow on her skin. Midas couldn't believe what he was seeing. Pain washed over his body like an overwhelming wave. He ran to her, desperate. "No, it can't be," he said, trying to touch her, but his hands only touched the golden surface. His daughter had been completely transformed into a golden statue, lifeless. At that moment, Midas realized the true tragedy of his wish. He had lost everything that truly mattered: his daughter, his happiness, his humanity. The gold he had, desired so much, had now distanced him from everything he loved. Midas, now in a state of complete despair, pulled away from his petrified daughter, his eyes filled with the pain of loss. His castle, once a place of joy and laughter, now seemed like a golden mausoleum. The lust for gold no longer filled his soul. Instead, it only made the emptiness inside him grow with each passing moment. But at that instant, a strange impulse still consumed him. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. But there was something else he needed to test, something he hadn't yet touched. Midas's mind was confused, but the power he now possessed was like a flame he couldn't extinguish. He looked at the grand banquet hall, where the tables were piled high with delicacies. The fountains of golden wine, the mountains of sweets, the stacks of fruits, everything around him looked dazzling. He could savor the perfection of gold, but his empty stomach bothered him, and the need to eat and drink was unbearable. And it was there, in that space that should have been the center of his happiness, that Midas, unable to feel any joy, decided to perform one last test. He approached a wine glass, a symbol of celebration that had accompanied him throughout his years of rule. Now, however, he looked at the liquid with a new perspective, not with pleasure but with need. Without hesitation, he lifted the glass to his lips, and when the wine touched his mouth, something strange happened. The golden liquid didn't remain as wine. It immediately turned into liquid metal, hot and sticky. Midas recoiled, dropping the glass, which fell to the ground with a metallic clang. The thirst and hunger were beginning to eat away at him. He sat on the golden throne he had created, and hours passed slowly as he reflected on everything he had lost. Every object he touched, every attempt to eat, only worsened his situation. The gold, once a symbol of his deepest desire, had now become his greatest pain. But what hurt him the most wasn't the physical suffering, but what the transformation into gold had caused in what he loved most: the disconnection from his daughter. She was there, motionless, and he could do nothing. The love he felt for her now seemed as distant as the stars. Sitting there, surrounded by his own mistake, Midas realized that the feast he had organized to celebrate his new life was, in fact, a celebration of his own ruin. What had once been a vision of glory was now only a scene of loneliness and emptiness. It was the end of the feast and the beginning of the lament. He no longer cared about gold. He no longer cared about being the richest man in the world, because the only thing he desired now was to turn back, to reverse time and undo the foolish wish he had made. Midas, now powerless, watched with tired eyes the shadows of the palace, stretching along the golden walls. The weight of his own choice crushed him with each passing second. He wanted to scream. He wanted someone, anyone, to be there to help him. But he was alone, surrounded only by cold silver and the gold that had trapped him. Hunger consumed him. Every piece of bread, every fruit he tried to grab, every sip of wine he hoped to drink instantly turned to metal. cold and insurmountable. His mouth was dry, his throat burning with thirst, and the pain of not being able to taste anything was unbearable. The banquet, which should have been a celebration of a wish granted, now seemed like an endless torture. With trembling hands, Midas tried to grab a piece of bread. As he held it, what was once a soft, warm food hardened into a heavy bar of gold. He stared at it, shocked, and dropped the gold piece, which hit the floor with a metallic clink, as if he were being punished for his own desire. He looked at the wine cup on his table. His eyes flickered with a spark of hope, as though the ruby liquid could bring some relief, a breath of air. But when his lips touched the wine, he didn't find the sweet and comforting taste of the drink he used to enjoy. The liquid immediately turned into melted gold, hot and scalding, spilling from the cup and falling onto the stone floor. "No! It can't be!" he cried out in muffled desperation. His thirst was endless, but the curse he had brought upon himself wouldn't let him rest. The taste of happiness, which he once thought was gold, was now a pain that burned hotter than fire. Every movement of his hands, every gesture he made in search of something real, became a sentence of suffering. The gold shone, but there was nothing in it that was valuable anymore. He stepped away from the table, feeling a growing weakness in his body, and it was there, in that place of excess and wealth, where shadows danced on the golden walls, that Midas realized the magnitude of his tragedy. He had conquered the world, but lost everything that truly mattered. The gold couldn't feed his soul, couldn't heal his pain, couldn't bring his daughter back or restore his inner peace. In that moment, Midas knew his greed had trapped him in a nightmare from which he could never wake. The gold he had so desperately wanted was not a blessing but a curse, pushing him further away from everything he held dear. His wish had been granted, but not in the way he had imagined. He had asked for everything to turn to gold. But what he really desired, more than riches, was to turn back time, to have his daughter back, to return to his old world. Midas's pain grew with every passing minute. He was immersed in his own suffering, feeling the longing for his daughter grow like a shadow that consumed him. His thoughts were focused on her, how she used to run to him when he returned to the palace after a long day, how her laughter would fill the halls of the castle. But now her laughter was gone, and her smile, which he cherished so much, was lost forever, frozen in gold. When Midas looked at his daughter, who still stood in the center of the hall, motionless like a golden statue, a cry of anguish rose from his chest. The gold that now imprisoned him had also trapped her. He couldn't touch her, couldn't embrace her, couldn't do anything but mourn his own blindness. The figure of his daughter, shining and cold, seemed to mock him, a memory of a lost love, immortalized in a lifeless glow. Desperate, he ran to her, tears filling his eyes. His mind no longer reasoned. He was overcome with panic and pain. He called her name, but his daughter remained still, her golden eyes fixed on a distant point far from his reach. It was as if his own daughter was lost forever in a prison of gold, and he was the one responsible for her sentence. With trembling hands, Midas approached and, without thinking, embraced her. But as he did so, something terrible happened. The moment his hands touched the cold, golden surface of the statue, the magic activated once again. The touch he had feared so much became fatal. His daughter's body, which had previously been frozen in a silent expression, fully transformed. Midas felt a tightness in his heart as he watched her form become even stiffer, her body taking on a rigidity he had never imagined. The desperate touch he had given her, wanting to embrace her, made her even more of a statue than she already was. Brighter and colder, more distant. She was no longer just a figure of gold, but an eternal part of the curse he had brought upon the world. Midas fell to his knees, despair overtaking his soul. He held her against his chest, still hoping she would move, hoping she would wake from the nightmare he had created. But nothing happened, nothing but the pain of an irreparable loss. The heat of the pain now filling his heart was stronger than anything he had ever felt. The gold around him, which once seemed so desirable, now made him tremble with fear. It was a golden prison, a prison of his own choices. King Midas, who had always believed that gold was the reward for a well-lived life, now saw that true value lay in the things he had neglected: love, family, human connections. But it was too late for him. That gold he had once loved had now stolen everything that truly mattered. Midas, holding his petrified daughter, finally understood the bitter truth. He would never have what he loved most. He had lost his daughter, his happiness, his humanity. He was now the richest king in the world, but in his wealth he had become the poorest person. The castle, once filled with laughter and joy, was now plunged into a deep, oppressive silence. The sound of Midas's footsteps echoed through the empty chambers, and the shine of gold made everything even darker, as if every corner of the palace was a reminder of the tragedy he had caused. The pain in his chest was unbearable. He no longer cared about treasures, riches, or the material goods he had accumulated over the years. What he truly wanted couldn't be bought, couldn't be turned into gold. He wanted his daughter back. He wanted his life back, without the curse he had. So carelessly invoked, Midas found himself lost in a sea of regret, a constant agony consuming him. He wandered through the vast halls of the palace, touching the golden surfaces, remembering how these riches had once been his greatest treasure, his greatest desire. But now, all he saw were invisible chains, binding him to his own destruction. He could barely look at the gold without feeling excruciating pain. He remembered Dionysus's words when the god granted his wish. He remembered the warning, the caution given, but that he hadn't listened to. In his selfishness and greed, he had ignored the advice, and now he was paying the price. And more than anything, he deeply regretted not paying attention to the silence that might have spoken louder than any words. The silence, perhaps, was the key to saving his life. Sitting in one of the chairs of his golden throne, Midas began to weep. The tears ran down his face and fell heavily onto the golden stones of the floor. He could no longer remember the last moment of true happiness he had felt. He deeply lamented putting his obsession with wealth above everything that truly mattered. His family, the love of his daughter, the simple joy of life's little things. What a fool I was, he thought to himself, as he gazed at the statue of his daughter gleaming in the room before him. The gold that had once been a symbol of power and success was now his greatest enemy. He wanted nothing more than to undo what he had done, and the truth of his own tragedy consumed him from within. And then he remembered the promise Dionysus had made, that the god would help him if he was truly sorry for his wish. Midas felt a small spark of hope in his heart. He knew there was only one chance to fix his mistake, and it was in the hands of the god he had so recklessly defied. With renewed determination, Midas stood up, no longer caring about the wealth around him, and began to walk out of the palace. He knew there was nothing left for him inside the golden walls, nothing that could bring relief to his tormented soul. He needed to meet Dionysus, ask for forgiveness, and beg the god to undo the curse. Your journey wouldn't be easy. Regret was a fierce pain, and the road to Dionysus would be long, but at least he had one hope: the chance to restore his daughter, to save what remained of his humanity, and perhaps to regain the love he had once neglected. Midas walked once again through the lands of Phrygia, but this time there were no treasures around him, no golden riches shining in the sun. He had nothing left but his own heavy conscience, his heart tight with regret, and a desperate desire to correct what he had done. The palace, once his fortress of power, now seemed like a mausoleum of gold, and he could no longer bear its presence. The ruins of his own greed were evident in every step he took. Exile was his choice, not an imposition. Midas knew that by distancing himself from the life he had known, he could at least free himself from the temptation to continue seeking what had now become his curse. He walked through the forest without a set destination, but with a purpose: to step away from the material world and in silence reflect on what truly mattered. The forest was dense, silent, and its natural sounds were a relief to his ears, so used to the sound of gold clinking against the palace walls. Every leaf that fell from the trees seemed to carry a message of renewal, and for a moment he felt as though he were being purified by the simple act of walking beneath the shade of the trees. Amidst all that tranquility, the weight of his regret was no longer so overwhelming. Midas moved away from the villages and towns where he could still hear rumors about his riches, about his former fame. He knew people saw him as a king who had been blessed and then cursed, but he no longer wanted to be remembered that way. He wanted to disappear, to fade away, even to lose himself. Gold now disturbed him deeply, and he knew that if he touched any living being or object, that fatal touch would condemn him again. For days, Midas wandered through the forest aimlessly, allowing himself to be guided by nature and inner reflection. He constantly thought about the loss of his daughter, the pain he had caused, and how his obsession had blinded him to the true values of life. He wanted to understand what he had done wrong and how he might, if possible, correct his actions. At night, he would light small fires but rarely slept. When sleep came, it was tormented by nightmares. His daughter, now a statue of gold, would return to him asking for freedom, but he couldn't touch her, fearing she would turn back. He would wake up in panic, his mind consumed by guilt, but somewhere deep within him, a spark of hope still shone. Midas knew he had done something unforgivable, but he still believed he could find a way to restore balance, to redeem himself in the eyes of the gods, and perhaps of his own daughter. The forest, with its stillness and wild beauty, became a sanctuary for Midas. He began to live off what nature offered, hunting and gathering fruits, and somehow this connected him with the simplicity of life. Slowly, he learned that what truly mattered wasn't what he owned, but what he was. Solitude, though bitter, allowed him to see the world with new eyes. The sounds of the forest, the winds blowing through the trees, even the birds singing now, held a deeper meaning for Midas. He was stepping away from the life he once led and embracing a new understanding of his existence. Each step he took in the forest felt lighter, closer to true redemption. He knew his encounter with Dionysus was near. And finally, with a humility he never thought he would feel, Midas prepared to return to the god who, with a single chance, might help him correct the mistake he so deeply regretted. The Phrygian forest seemed quieter than ever that morning. Midas was on his knees, his hands tired and dirty from the journey, but his spirit renewed by a deep determination. He no longer cared for the gold that had once ruled him. The golden shine of ambition had faded, and now only his soul remained. Eager for forgiveness, Midas knew he could no longer live with the weight of his choices. He had lost his daughter, his love, and most importantly, his peace of mind. His only chance to restore all that he had destroyed was to appeal to the one who had granted him the fatal gift. Dionysus, the god of wine and pleasure, but also of renewal and transformation. He raised his eyes to the gray sky, where the first light of dawn gently touched the leaves of the trees. Midas took a deep breath, feeling the cool air enter his lungs. There, amidst the nature he had learned to respect, he prepared to make the most humble request of his life. O Dionysus, lord of wine and transformation, who rules the pleasures and pains of the world, hear me. I, Midas, come to you not with riches or promises of power, but with a broken heart, with eyes full of regret. The gold I so desired was my ruin, and now I call for a second chance. Return my daughter to me. Return to me the simplicity and joy of the little things. I want nothing more than peace." His words, though full of regret, were sincere. Midas no longer saw himself as a king, but as an ordinary man, someone who had lost everything that truly mattered and now only wished to regain what had been destroyed. He closed his eyes, waiting, but also fearing what would come next. The hours passed, slowly as Midas remained there in silence, in prayer. He felt the weight of his own mistakes, but also a faint hope that perhaps Dionysus would hear him. During this time, the wind began to change, blowing stronger, bringing with it a sense of change in the air. Midas opened his eyes and saw a presence forming before him. It was Dionysus. The god appeared before him in an unexpected form. Instead of being a majestic and imposing being, Dionysus appeared in a simple, almost earthly state, like an ordinary man, but with a soft glow around his figure. He wasn't dressed in the robes of a grand god, but in a simple tunic, almost like a monk's. In his hands he held a cup of wine, but there was no exuberance in his presence. There was, however, a quiet understanding. Midas, with his heart pounding, stood before the god and with a reverent gesture bowed. "O great Dionysus, I beg you to help me," he said, his voice trembling. "I have made a terrible mistake, and now I live with the consequence of it. If you can, free me from this curse and allow me to correct what I've destroyed." Dionysus watched Midas in silence for a long moment. There was no anger or reproach. In his eyes, only a calm that seemed to reflect the very shadows of the forest. He looked at the man now standing before him, who was no longer the greedy king he had once been, but someone who had finally understood the weight of his actions. "You asked for what you didn't understand, Midas," Dionysus spoke softly, "and that is why you are here now, asking for redemption. What you did cannot be undone easily, but your pain is real. I see in you a man who has learned the true nature of loss." Midas swallowed hard, his heart tightened by the god's words, but also with a sense of relief. He knew he had finally taken the first step toward forgiveness. He was no longer speaking to a demanding or severe god, but to a divinity that understood the twisted paths of humanity. "I will do whatever it takes, my lord," Midas replied, his voice firmer. "I'll do anything to get my daughter back and to be worthy of a second chance." Dionysus smiled softly, as if approving of the fallen king's sincerity. "What you seek is not something that can be easily given, Midas. You must go to the Pactolus River and there purify yourself." "To the river?" Midas asked, surprised. "But what must I do there?" "Simple," Dionysus said. "Wash your hands in the waters of Pactolus, and your curse will be carried away by the current. The river, with its eternal flow, can heal even the deepest wounds. It is there that you will find the end of this journey." Midas felt a spark of hope shine in his heart. He knew his quest was nearing its end, and with it, perhaps the chance to reclaim what he loved most. Midas, with his heart racing, knew that his last hope rested on Dionysus's promise. He now had a clear mission to go to the Pactolus River and cleanse himself, and with that, perhaps restore his daughter's life and the balance he had lost. The god of wine, with his calming presence, had shown him a path to redemption, but Midas knew the journey would still be long and filled with challenges. The morning had advanced, and the forest around him seemed to breathe along with him, as if everything in nature was aware of the great task Midas had ahead. He began his walk, his feet dragging slowly over the leaf-covered ground, his body weighed down by the guilt that still followed him. But a flicker of hope began to ignite in his chest, a flame that still fed on the promise of forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. The journey to the Pactolus River was not easy. The path was long and winding, the trees dense and the stones slippery, but Midas did not stop. He knew time was running out, and his daughter, his sweet daughter, still remained a golden statue, lost to him in the palace. Finally, after hours of walking, Midas reached the bank of the Pactolus River. The water flowing there seemed to have a soft glow, as if it carried in its bed the weight of many stories and curses already washed away. Midas approached the bank and looked at the river, feeling a mix of reverence and despair. He knelt, his hands trembling as they touched the cool water. The golden glow of the curse that had once touched everything he owned began to slowly fade, as the current gently carried away the golden dust. He felt an immediate relief, as if the river itself was absorbing his sorrows and guilt. Midas submerged his hands deeper into the water, and as he did, an indescribable sensation of lightness enveloped him. The memories of his greed, the echoes of his old obsession with gold seemed to be swept away by the current, disappearing as if they had never existed. At that moment, he felt Dionysus's presence once again. The god was there, invisible but tangible, like a soft breeze that spread through the air. Midas knew the purification process was happening, and more importantly, that the chance to undo what he had done was truly within his reach. "You have shown genuine remorse, Midas," Dionysus's voice echoed softly in his mind. "The path to purification is long and painful, but it is the only one that can grant you forgiveness. What you asked for will no longer be your burden. Now, go with the confidence that the lesson has been learned, and your journey is near its end." Midas, with tears in his eyes, looked once more at the waters of the Pactolus. The river now reflected the sunlight, creating a play of colors that made him feel as if he were being reborn, a new chance being given to him. "I understand now," Midas murmured, more to himself than to anything else. "The true value of life isn't in gold, it's in what we give to others, in the love we share, and in what we choose to be." With a light heart, Midas stood up from the riverbank. He knew his task was not yet fully completed, but now he felt he could take the next step. He was more prepared, wiser. The water of the Pactolus had taken away the curse that had tormented him so long, and with it, part of the weight of his former life. It was time to return home, to his daughter. It was time to repair what he had destroyed, to seek true redemption. Midas felt the gentle evening breeze caress his face as he rose from the purifying waters of the Pactolus. The sound of the river running was like a song that invited him to move forward, to something beyond his deepest hopes. The sense that the golden curse was finally being removed from him was tangible. But still, he felt a weight in his chest. Not only the memory of his golden daughter, but the recognition of the suffering he had caused himself and everyone around him. With lighter steps than ever, Midas began his walk back to the palace. Every step he took reflected the new man he was becoming. He knew he would still need to face the consequences of his choices, but for the first time, he felt he could change the course of his story. The way back was shorter than the journey to the river. Not because the terrain was easier, but because deep in his being, Midas felt he was already home. Not in the golden palace he once considered his greatest achievement, but in the new home he was about to build with his remorse and his change of heart. As he walked, he thought about his daughter. His eyes, still imagining the golden glow of her petrified image, now seemed different. Midas no longer feared gold. He knew his daughter deserved far more than a life of material wealth. She deserved a full life, a life that could only be restored by him, a renewed man willing to undo the damage he had caused. Arriving at the palace, Midas found the grand hall empty. The golden glow that once dominated the space now seemed oppressive and unnecessary. He no longer wanted this wealth. He no longer wanted anything that was a false illusion of happiness. But his daughter, the image of his golden daughter, still hovered over him like an unbearable weight. With determination, he made his way to the altar where the statue had been placed. The gold that covered it seemed colder now, more distant. Midas knelt before the inert figure of his daughter, his hands still damp from the Pactolus River. He knew what he had to do. "Child," he whispered, his voice full of pain and love, "I was a fool. I was blinded by greed, and it led you to this fate. But please allow me to correct my mistake." Midas lifted the statue in his arms carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world, and indeed it was. He left the palace, heading for the river, the only source of redemption he now believed could save his daughter. The Pactolus River, with its gentle glow, seemed to wait for him. He knelt once again, with the statue of his daughter in his hands, and slowly dipped the golden figure into the water. The sound of the flowing river, the gentleness of the current, was like a promise of healing. And then, when he took the statue from the waters, the golden color slowly faded, and the flesh of his daughter began to return, soft as the skin of a newborn child. Little by little she came to life again, and when her eyes opened, Midas felt a profound relief, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. The girl looked at him, surprised, but with an expression of unconditional love he had longed to see. The embrace she gave him was the purest, most sincere, and Midas knew that although his redemption was still in progress, he had already taken the first step toward restoring everything he had lost. "Father," she whispered, still without words, but with a look that said everything. Midas held her tightly, feeling life return to his family, to his home, and finally understanding that there is no greater wealth than true love. Midas, with his daughter in his arms, felt a new kind of warmth flood his heart. It was the warmth of true wealth, the kind that cannot be bought or touched, but earned through remorse, love, and redemption. He looked at his daughter with an expression that blended gratitude and relief. The miracle of having her back to life made every second of suffering worth it. But as the soft glow of gold disappeared in the waters of the Pactolus, Midas knew his path of transformation was not yet complete. Though his daughter had been brought back to life, he too needed healing. He needed to rid himself of the pain and guilt that consumed him. The journey to that point, through the shadows of his own greed, had deeply marked him. The king knew purification was still necessary. The god Dionysus, with his unpredictable nature and wisdom, had been clear. "Midas, wash yourself, but not just your hands. Wash your soul. The river will carry the weight of your curse, and with it, the gold that still exists in you." Midas looked at the river, with its golden crystals scattered across the waters, reflections of his own transformation. He felt that, somehow, the river's water would not only remove the worst of him, but also prepare him for the new man he had to become. But there was a price to pay, and he knew that. The king walked to the waters of the Pactolus once more, but this time without haste. He dipped his arms into the cold water, allowing the current to flow around his skin as if he were absorbing the true essence of healing. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of his greed, the suffering he had caused, and at the same time, the lightness that was beginning to invade his being. It was as if the current were carrying away the chains that had bound him to his obsession with gold. With each passing moment, Midas felt his body lighter, his mind clearer. He knew he couldn't return to the man he once was, not after everything that had happened. Not after feeling his daughter's pain, seeing his own life unravel in the insane pursuit of riches that in the end meant nothing. The waters of the Pactolus seemed to understand his tears of regret. The cold water purified his soul as the sun set on the horizon, casting golden and soft hues on the river, as if nature itself were witnessing his transformation. He felt he could finally breathe again. When he stepped out of the river, the chains of guilt and greed that had once defined him seemed to dissipate. Midas sat at the riverbank, watching the flow of water that still carried the golden shine of gold particles. He knew he was a free man now, but this freedom would not be found in the emptiness of the golden palace or in the pursuit of power. It would come in the simple act of starting anew, of giving love, of being generous, of teaching his daughter the value of humility and truth. He stood up slowly, and with a serene look, he headed home. But this time, his heart wasn't heavy with the weight of riches. He knew the true treasure wasn't in the palace vaults, but in the lessons he had learned, in the moments with his daughter, and in the new chance life had given him. And so, Midas, now healed and transformed, prepared to rebuild his life, not with gold, but with the most precious thing he had found on his journey. The wisdom that the true value of life isn't in what we can touch, but in what we can share. With a renewed heart and a spirit relieved by purification, Midas walked back to his kingdom, but no longer as the man who once loved gold above all else. The palace, which had always been a golden prison, now seemed distant, as if it were a place he no longer belonged to. He wasn't in a hurry to arrive, for he knew the most important thing had already been done. His soul was clean and his daughter revived. As he entered the palace gates, the air was fresher, the sound of the fountains seemed softer, as if the very walls of the castle recognized the change within the king. The contrast between the gold that once dominated him and the serenity that now enveloped him was immense. Midas's palace, once filled with riches he believed were everything, now seemed empty. He no longer felt the need to be the richest man in the world. Now true wealth lay in his daughter, in his health, and in the new bond he had with life. Midas' daughter, after being restored, was still amazed by the miracle. She, who had been consumed by the pain of loss and transformation, now had a renewed sparkle in her eyes. The embrace Midas gave her in that moment was more than a simple gesture of affection. It was a promise that everything would be different. There would be no more room for the gold that had once separated them, only for love and the moments to be shared. The conversations in the palace had changed as well. Midas, once so focused on accumulating wealth and forming alliances based on power, now spoke with his subjects about how true greatness is found in the hearts of people, in generosity, humility, and compassion. He knew the true meaning of a prosperous kingdom wasn't in its treasure, but in the happiness and well-being of its people. Midas began distributing his wealth, the very riches he had once valued so much, to those in need, building hospitals, schools, and offering support to the families who needed it most. His advisors, who had once seen him as a temperamental monarch obsessed with his possessions, now saw in Midas a more compassionate and wise leader. But the change wasn't instantaneous for everyone. Some members of the court still clung to the old belief that gold was the only path to glory. However, Midas, with patience and wisdom, began to shift the thinking of his nobility, teaching them that the true treasures lie in what one can offer others, not in what one accumulates for oneself. Little by little, Midas's kingdom flourished, no longer as an empire of material wealth, but as a kingdom of well-being and true prosperity. He began to be remembered not as the king of gold, but as the monarch who changed his own story, and with it, that of his entire people. And so, Midas, the king who was once consumed by greed, now became a symbol of redemption and wisdom. He knew that, although gold could shine and fascinate, what truly mattered was love and the ability to transform the lives of others. Midas' kingdom was in full transformation, But the king felt there was still something more to be done. His daughter, now restored to life, walked by his side, and with her a new purpose blossomed in his heart. But there was something the king had to do, something he knew would give true meaning to his change. He didn't want to just live in peace with himself, but wanted to ensure that everyone in his kingdom could live the same way. Midas took his daughter, now full of life and joy, to the royal garden, where the rays of the sun gently fell on the flowers. He embraced her tenderly, and they sat on the grass watching the sky. There in silence, Midas reflected on everything he had learned, on how true life isn't measured by the weight of gold, but by human relationships, love, and generosity. "My daughter," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "of all the things I could wish for, what I truly wanted was to have you by my side, without fear, without bitterness. I made a mistake, but now I know that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we can share." The young woman looked at him, her eyes shining with understanding. "I understand, Father. Life gave us a second chance, and that's more valuable than any gold or precious stone." The king smiled, gently touching his daughter's head. "Yes, my daughter, and this miracle isn't just ours. What we've lived is a lesson that must be passed on." With this new understanding, Midas went to the heart of the kingdom and announced that he was renouncing his accumulated wealth. He asked everyone in his court to follow him on this path. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to change the fate of all, starting with himself. He ordered that the palace be rebuilt, not with gold, but with the best of each generous heart in the kingdom, and that his wealth be redistributed to ensure no one would suffer hardships. But the real change, Midas knew, was within the people. He began visiting the villagers, sharing with them the wisdom he had acquired on his own journey. He spoke about the importance of being humble, appreciating what life offers, and living justly and compassionately. And so, with patience and dedication, he transformed his court and his people, spreading the teachings about true wealth. One morning, however, as Midas was walking through the fields with his daughter, something unexpected happened. A farmer who knew the story of his transformation approached and, with a deep expression of reverence, handed the king a rare and radiant flower. "King Midas," said the farmer, his voice trembling, "I know gold is no longer your desire, but this flower, with its natural shine, is a small gift for you, to remind you that true beauty lies in the simple things in life." Midas took the flower with an indescribable sense of gratitude. He no longer needed more material wealth, for he had found something far more precious: true human goodness, generosity, and unconditional love. And it was there, in that field, that Midas realized that true redemption wasn't just about bringing his daughter back to life or changing the fate of his kingdom. True redemption was about being able to live with a pure heart, free from greed, and sharing that with others. That was what truly mattered. The miracle of Midas's redemption wasn't just about him, but about everyone around him. And so his name was remembered not as the king who desired gold, but as the man who found true wealth in what is intangible, in love, wisdom, and generosity. With Midas's kingdom transformed, the king began to realize that true change wasn't just in the way he saw the world, but in how he related to the people around him. He had found a new purpose and dedicated himself to it with the same intensity he once devoted to accumulating riches. However, what surprised him most was the effect his transformation had on those around him. The courtiers, who once bowed before his fortune, now saw him as a different man. He was no longer the monarch who demanded blind obedience. Midas became someone who listened, who cared about the problems of others, and was always willing to help. He became a leader by example, showing through his actions that true power doesn't come from material wealth, but from a life lived with honor and an open heart. His daughter, who had been one of the greatest victims of his former obsession, became his greatest ally. Together, they visited the farmers, talked to the villagers, and were always welcomed because the people felt that something had changed, not just in the king, but in the kingdom itself. Midas no longer spoke of gold or jewels. His conversations focused on how they could improve people's lives, ensuring no one was left behind. He knew that with his new perspective, he could build a more just and balanced society. Over time, the king realized that his inner transformation also reflected an external change in his kingdom. The land that had once been stagnant, dominated by the worship of gold and wealth, flourished. The cities prospered, the fields became more fertile, and the villages lived in harmony. Greed was replaced by generosity, selfishness gave way to solidarity, and peace reigned where there had once been discord. Midas became a symbol not only of redemption, but of true leadership. He knew that while material wealth was fleeting, the value he spread throughout the kingdom would last forever. By renouncing gold, Midas had gained something far more valuable: the respect, admiration, and love of his people. In his final year of reign, Midas decided that his legacy would be built upon the foundations he had helped establish. He planned for the education of future generations, creating schools and centers of learning, where the youth could learn not just about governance and administration, but also about human values, such as respect, compassion, and empathy. Midas's kingdom thrived like never before, and his name was not remembered as the king who asked for riches without considering the consequences, but as the man who transformed his life, his city, and his people by embracing the true values of life. His story spread to distant lands, and travelers told the legend of how Midas, the king of gold, found true wealth in the hearts of those around him. In the end, Midas felt at peace. He knew that despite his past mistakes, he had done everything he could to correct his story. His journey of self-discovery and transformation had become his greatest treasure. After the great transformation, Midas felt he no longer needed riches to be happy. He had learned through painful experience that the real value of life isn't measured in gold or jewels, but in the relationships we cultivate and the inner peace we achieve. The king, now wiser and more serene, renounced the treasures accumulated throughout his life and made sure to share his fortune with the people. He ordered that the gold mines and treasure chambers be opened and distributed among the peasants, merchants, and craftsmen. Every piece of gold that once represented Midas's greatest desire now became a means of exchange to improve the lives of others. He built hospitals, schools, and centers of care, ensuring that everyone in the kingdom had access to basic care and education. It wasn't just material wealth that Midas gave to others. He also shared the knowledge he had gained throughout his journey of transformation. He began teaching the children of his subjects that true wealth lies in being generous, helping others, and cultivating relationships based on trust and respect. For Midas, that was the true gold, the good that spread and multiplied without anyone seeing it. His daughter, who had once been turned into a golden statue, also became a symbol of redemption. Together, father and daughter began visiting the villages to encourage generosity and cooperation among the villagers. The girl, now fully alive, helped her father deliver messages of love and care, becoming an example of the transformative power that had touched everyone. The kingdom flourished like never before. Hard work and commitment to the community took the place of the relentless pursuit of wealth. Every day, more people arrived seeking wisdom and support, drawn by the reputation of Midas, who had become a model of just and enlightened leadership. For tea, people, now more united, felt free from the greed that had once threatened to destroy them. And so, Midas's kingdom thrived, not as the kingdom of gold, but as the kingdom of true prosperity. The prosperity of the heart, the soul, and the mind. The years that followed were ones of peace and harmony, and Midas never again felt the need for more gold. The true reward for Midas was simple: the smile of his daughter, the respect of his people, and the certainty that he had done his part to build a better world. He knew that by renouncing his obsession, he had found something far more valuable than gold: the freedom to be who he truly was. And so, King Midas, the one who once wished for everything around him to turn to gold, was remembered not as a man of wealth, but as an example of redemption, wisdom, and true leadership. The story of Midas spread to every corner of the world, not as a simple fable about greed and regret, but as a powerful lesson about the dangers of the relentless pursuit of power and material wealth. The tale of the king who lost everything he loved due to a selfish wish, and who, after learning from his tragedy, redeemed himself and found true fortune in love and generosity, was passed down from generation to generation. The elders and wise people of the villages began using Midas's example as a warning, a reminder not to be seduced by the easy promises of wealth. They taught that true prosperity came from humility, hard work, and the ability to appreciate what is truly important. Gold, which had once been seen as the key to a life of happiness, was now seen as a trap. Dionysus himself, observing the result of Midas's journey, smiled with a faint smile of satisfaction. The god of wine knew that by granting that wish, he had not only tested the king's heart, but had also given the world a powerful story. The true strength of the gods, Dionysus thought, was not in giving gifts, but in teaching the lessons that mortals needed to learn to grow and evolve. Meanwhile, Midas, now in his old age, walked peacefully through the fields of his kingdom. He felt an inner peace he had never imagined possible. There were no more races after gold or the futile distractions of life. In his heart, he knew that he had found true happiness, the kind that comes from within, from the unconditional love for his daughter, his land, and his people. And so, the story of Midas left an indelible mark on the collective memory of mortals. The neighboring kingdoms began adopting policies of mutual aid and shared prosperity, inspired by the example of the king who had left everything behind in search of something more valuable. And, like all good stories, Midas's lesson never disappeared. It persisted in the hearts of future generations, teaching everyone that the true treasure isn't in the wealth we can accumulate, but in the people we love and the good deeds we do throughout our lives. Midas's legacy, though marked by tragedy, became a beacon of wisdom for the men and women who, like him, sought true happiness. For in the end, Midas discovered that true wealth was, in fact, what can't be touched: love, gratitude, and the wisdom gained through experience and regret. And so, the king who turned everything to gold was, in the end, remembered as the man who finally understood what truly mattered, and with that his story became an eternal lesson, capable of transcending centuries, cultures, and borders. So, what do you think of the story of Midas? A deep lesson about greed and the true value of life, right? Now we want to hear from you. What's your opinion on what really matters in life? Leave your comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video and are interested in more stories like this, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss any fascinating stories full of life lessons. See you in the next video, where we'll explore more myths and lessons that transcend time. Until then,